woman I know, literally the toughest woman I know, my mother. And before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about my mom. In spite of all the challenges she has faced, which have been a lot, I promise you, it's going to be amazing when you hear it. She has overcome just about everything, every obstacle. She's never taken no for an answer, and ultimately ended up in business, retiring, just doing such a great job. She sold her pet manufacturing company, which turned into an international company, and she recently sold that. And I'm just so proud of her. So I'm not going to give away what she's done in her life because I want that to be part of the conversation. But welcome, Mom.
Thank you, honey. I might add, you've done a fantastic job on your book, which I
thank
read.
you.
Most people are reading your book. I found that I was reliving part of that book.
Yeah, that's a little hard.
Very good. Very good. Fantastic.
Yeah, I might add that when you're writing a memoir, you have to remember that you're ripping off Band-Aids for other people. You're sort of opening old wounds, and you have to kind of remember that because it's not easy. So when people are still alive and you're talking about their lives, it can be challenging. So thank you. So I have a lot of questions because not everybody's read the book yet. The book actually doesn't come out until January 5th, and I've been giving little stories so people would understand what's happening in the book. But there's a lot. And when I talk about some of the challenges I overcame, not just in my childhood, I mean, let's admit it, some of my trauma was self-induced in my 20s, but just childhood stuff that I overcame, you overcame more. And so that's the interesting thing. You were determined to make my life better than yours, and you did. So when people read my story and they realize you really did a lot to improve what you went through, that says a lot because it was pretty crazy. So I want to touch on some of those things. One of the stories in my book talks about how you left home when you were 16. You literally lived on the street for a while. So what would prompt someone to leave home at 16 years old and live on the street? I mean, that really says a lot about the situation that you were in and why, there had to be something.
Well, I didn't desert my family. I was running for self-preservation. I talked to a psychologist who advised me, you don't ruin 3 lives for the price of 1.
Okay, so dig into that a little bit. So what you're trying to say is, I think you're talking about grandma. She was going through a hard time mentally.
Well, more than that, we had neighbors who created gossip, and gossip creates a lot of damage.
So there was a lot of stuff going on at home, basically.
Yes.
So basically what was happening is there was a lot of drama at home. Grandma was going through a lot of stuff, and that was starting to affect you mentally.
Many divorce hearings, child custody hearings, and that wasn't the same then as it is now. And we were drugged through them. So mine was self-preservation. I couldn't focus. Grades failing, changing high schools, many, many, many different reasons. And then after I left home and on the street for a long time, I actually took responsibility for my parents instead of continuing my education.
So your story is pretty wild. I talk about it in my book. And I know, we're not going to dig too much into it, but people hear, okay, well, a lot of kids go through divorce, but trust me, it was not quite that simple. I mean, there were situations where, and I love my grandmother, and this is what we talk about at Amen Clinics. It's easy to call people bad. It's harder to ask why. I actually think she was misdiagnosed. I think she wasn't treated properly, but she'd wake you up in the middle of the night and screaming and, have you scrubbing floors and washing windows and calling you names. And she didn't mean it.
No.
But she was not treated properly.
Hormones, I really feel.
But whatever it was hard.
It was major imbalance. Yes.
Yeah. So you ran away from home, and then you end up taking them in later, which means you obviously started to turn your life around with a lot of hard work and a lot of challenges. So most people would never overcome that. Most people would never actually get to the place of being able to even turn their lives around. How did you get to that place?
Well, 2 things. One, my dad always told me, look at the absolute worst that can happen. If you can overcome that, you can overcome anything in between.
So imagine the worst thing that's possible.
Yes. Also, at 17, I asked God if he could show me what he wanted. I promised to follow. He did, I did. Ever since then, I followed directions. Simple as that. And if he would have asked me in my 20s, what do you want? If I would have told him what I wanted at 20, of course, I would have fallen far short from what he blessed me with.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Even with all my trials
Yeah,
that I came up with, because he blessed me far more.
I love that.
Hmm.
That's amazing.
But, the Bible says, if you have faith, I will bless you. But if you follow your faith, I will magnify you.
I love that. So one of the things that I find so colorful about you, I sort of describe you in my book as this cross between Lucille Ball and the Tasmanian Devil. So
that was tagged on me, by the way.
You've mellowed out a little bit, now in these years. But when I was growing up, I mean, there's nothing you wouldn't take on. And I'm not joking when I say that. To survive, you usually were working 3 jobs, had a janitorial business, you had a steam cleaning business, you drove 18-wheelers. I mean, you would literally do anything to survive. But then after that, eventually you weren't just surviving, you were thriving. And that's pretty crazy that you could take that, and you didn't really finish high school. So there are so many people. I'm so proud of you. I know for a long time that was hard for you. That was hard for you to deal with and talk about. And like, you felt bad about yourself for that. But when I think of that, I'm like, wow. I mean, that's pretty amazing that you never used it as an excuse. You never stopped. You never gave up. And you didn't just thrive in spite of your challenges. It's almost like you did because of them.
I always felt, unless it was brain surgery on myself, I could do it.
Well, you had that.
I know, but I didn't do it. But yeah, you're right. But I always felt like you either step out in faith or you hold back in fear. And in a way, if I had had a degree, I probably wouldn't have done some of the things I did, because I was always told, you can't do that.
Well, you would not have taken the risk for sure, probably.
Yeah, because they said you can't do that.
Yeah.
And I always thought, yeah, I can.
I remember growing up, you telling me you had to have your own business because no one was ever going to pay you what you were worth because you didn't have a degree.
Well, not only that, women couldn't make practically over minimum wage, couldn't work over 8 hours overtime. And we couldn't survive on that. Right. I was having to work 3 jobs just to survive. And then I thought, nah. And no laws on sexual harassment. Quit many jobs, didn't wait 20 years.
Yeah.
So it was like, have to create it. So my first corporation, I had a man's name in front of my name.
I know, I write that story. It's really
great.
My
God. Yeah. It had to be my maiden name and then another name.
So that's going to confuse people. But what she did is she took her middle name, Josephine, shortened it to Joe, and started her business under the name Joe Harris so that it looked like a man's company. It's a great story in the book about how she sort of overcame this sexual harassment and discrimination barrier.
Yeah, the boss is in town. I got to go. Yeah. I could get out of a lot of trouble that way. So
that's great. It's a great story. So I love that. And you were never limited by ladylike choices. And that was one thing that I realized. It was like, you didn't really care what the job was. You were just going to do it. So
it doesn't matter how dirty it is, as long as you're not ashamed to hold your head up.
Yeah. I love
and
that.
Grandma always said that.
And we see less of that in this generation, I think.
Grandma always said, someone can take everything you own, but no one can take your self-respect. You have to give it up.
Yeah, no, I love that. So this had a lot of impact on me, and we had some hard times when I was young, not just financially, but one thing, I mean, you were pretty much taking care of everyone in our family, your mother, your father. So you brought some of that chaos from your childhood ended up following us. Then you took care of your brother, who was a heroin addict, and it created some chaos for us growing up. But that's what the book is about. There's a lot of family drama in there. However, what I noticed eventually, which I didn't obviously appreciate when I was really young, was that your grit became my grit.
Yeah.
So over time, one of the lessons I learned from you was that there's a lot of things about my family I don't like, that I don't want to be like, but there are some things I really do like that I want to be like. And that was one.
I might add one thing. I know it was kind of after watching my brother's head fall in the spaghetti, but
Because he was on heroin.
When I told him I was taking him and I was going to drop him off on whatever street corner he wanted, he said, "I can't believe that you think your brother is a dope addict."
Yeah, I've had those conversations with people in my family.
I really think I was in self-denial.
Yeah, a little bit.
But it took a
because
lot.
he was your baby brother.
Yeah. And I was always taking care of him.
Yeah.
And still.
Yeah.
I can't, when it comes to family, we were always together. You know,
I didn't inherit that. I actually disconnected from pretty much everybody.
I know. I know.
Because of just the drama. So I had to learn, one of the things I had to learn, you had to learn how to draw boundaries. I had to learn how to reconnect.
I had to learn how to draw boundaries just to girls that needed help.
I know. Yeah, there were lots of strangers who moved into our house too. So.
You know, I used to think if anyone would have just given me a break. So I wanted to give.
So you trusted people who didn't necessarily deserve your trust.
I know.
Yeah.
I didn't think about how it affected you on that. I thought, no, that it was okay. And I was trying to teach other girls a trade, not just give them a job. Mm-hmm. So then I brought them in, gave them a room and a job.
And they would take advantage and steal stuff and cause problems. So again, you had to learn how to draw boundaries, right. And I had to learn how to not disconnect. Right. And so that environment sort of affected us differently.
True.
But it was, but here's one thing that I want to, through all of that, not a lot of people can say this, and this is really important. I always knew you would be there for me. And I can honestly say that you're my best friend. Yeah, growing up, like I knew that you were there. It was crazy sometimes, but it's not like the one thing that I felt was different between me and so many people that I knew who had so craziness in their lives is it's not like I didn't know you like I knew you loved me, and we ended up being best friends. And so that says a lot, and that goes a long way.
Against
and that covers a lot of stuff, and that's there's a lot of grace that goes with that, right?
Yeah, a lot of grace. You're right.
Yeah, and I think that's why we had more of a shot at healing than some people I've seen. And it's not that you don't. If you don't have that, I just think that healing or having good relationships certainly makes it easier.
You know, a parent always worries about, did I make a right decision? Am I doing the right thing? And I worried about all these different things because I sacrificed time with you in order to, what I thought, give you something better. It's the results that gives you your answer. Mm-hmm. You're walking with Christ, you having your daughter, and God says, I will bless you for 4 generations. That's my answer. Mm-hmm. I'm proud of you, and I'm proud of my granddaughter. Mm-hmm. And so I have my answer.
So it was worth some of the hard times.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. I would do it again.
I mean, there are things that I would have probably
maybe celebrate a few holidays and
but it's okay. I mean,
but I sacrificed my life. I don't remember having a life. Mm-hmm. And I give some advice. You can make more money, but you can't make more time.
So one of my favorite mom hero stories is also one of the hardest stories in my book to write about, was when my stepdad climbed in bed with me when I was 12. But unlike so many of the people that I knew growing up, some of my friends, rather than not being believed, she tried to kill him. Like she literally jumped on him. Yeah. But you believed me.
Yeah.
And I felt validated. And so
the minute you started your story,
that you knew before I even told you. And that's just a really important point, I think.
We didn't even get moved in together. I mean, it was like
It happened
immediate
right away, yeah.
into a,
So fortunately, I didn't have time to go too far, but it was pretty traumatic. And
yeah.
it was, and then you jumping on him and running down the street screaming was fairly traumatic.
It was better than shooting him.
Yes.
It was,
This is true. Yeah, you probably had more restraint than I would have. So I think a lot of mothers watching this are going to relate to that. But your grit eventually became my grit, and I feel like to some degree we sort of grew up together, and we were sort of working through some things together. And I had to raise myself. I mean, I was a latchkey kid. You were busy working, but we did, and we figured a lot of stuff out. So, not all women feel comfortable going to some of the extremes that I talk about in the book. I mean, not just as she attacked this guy that I just talked about. I remember her running down the hall with a shotgun, racking the shotgun when some guy was in our house, burglarizing our house. You were fiercely.
I was covering you to go to the neighbors to call the police.
I know, it's not the point. Not a lot of women will go to these extremes. And all I remember when I was growing up was this like wildly, fiercely protective, one of my memories of you that I remember it being one of my best memories and feeling so safe and so happy. We were out horseback riding for a whole day. We went whole day up in the mountains, just you and me. And it was so great. And you were such a, you loved your horse, and you were riding your horse. And I remember you getting off the horse. And as you were getting off the horse, you had this poncho on, and I saw the outline of your gun, which you carried frequently. And, it was this picture of this sort of like wild, intensely beautiful, protective woman in my life. And even though things were crazy, I kind of knew eventually it was going to be okay.
It was.
And at times I didn't always have that feeling, but that was one of those days I felt that way. It was one of those days where I'm like, if I could just freeze time right now, I know it would be okay.
I knew it'd be okay. God said it would. I knew it would. So
I love that. So I want, for people who are watching this, we're in unprecedented times. It's really hard for people right now. You went through so much. We went through so much. But what would you say is the single most important factor in overcoming? What was it for you that was the single most important factor in overcoming from this high school teenage runaway, high school dropout, teenage runaway, to this ultra successful entrepreneur?
I didn't do it alone. I was following direction. I promised God I would follow his direction. I would pray at night, and I knew what to do in the morning.
So faith.
It was my faith. I followed directions. I know people would say, and I'm telling you, only through the grace of God did I get here. Without a high school diploma and to reach these heights, it's not believing. Believing is it's trying. Faith is one step further. It's knowing and doing it.
Mm-hmm. And doing it even when you don't think you can.
When I knew I was supposed to take this job and then receive and take a different job afterwards, I was making double the money, more than double the money. I quit that job and took another job making way less because I knew I was supposed to do that.
Mm.
So that was, and my brother's telling me, are you crazy?
But you were just following.
But I was supposed to follow that direction. But it taught me business.
Mm.
And here I went from being homeless with nothing at 22 to buying my first house at almost 25.
Mm-hmm.
If you follow his direction, he blesses you.
Mm. So one thing I want to touch on, because your faith played a big part in your journey, but God wasn't a big discussion in our house when I was growing up. So you never faltered in your belief.
Mm.
but we didn't go to church. That wasn't a big discussion in our lives. My dad was a Baptist minister, but that was a whole nother crazy
It
story.
was a pushback for me.
But it
at
also
first.
was a crazy story because my dad being a minister was, well, that's a whole nother can of worms.
Let me add one thing, because I had pushed back from church, but my dad said one thing to me: don't lose your faith for another man's mistake.
Mhm.
And that saved me.
So I remember the turning point. One special time in my life was when, in my 20s, when I started going to a Bible study and you started going with me, and we really bonded over that. And that's when I remember us sort of going to church together.
Yeah.
And but I find it interesting that even though you didn't go to church, even though we didn't go to church, and that wasn't a topic of conversation in our home, you still never lost your faith.
Because I followed Christ. I never followed a man or a church because I didn't trust them. I lost my faith in man and church. But it was my dad's words that kept following me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said, okay, Christ I can always depend on. So I never lost faith in him.
Excellent. So what is the most important lesson you learned?
Well, 3 things. 1, never quit. Never give up, because you'll never get up.
I like that.
And I follow directions. I follow God, but it's my faith that I follow. And it's your grit, your determination that you need, that constant drive that you have to have, that gets you there. It's that drive and that determination. You know, if you value yourself by what people say, you're never going to win. But if you put your value in what God thinks you are, you'll always win. Because his value of you was greater than anyone else's. And it's constant and forgiving. And he gives you grace.
So I notice comments coming in and questions, and I will answer them as soon as we are done with the show. I'll reach out to you. I will answer your questions. But before we do that, before you leave for the day, I want you to leave listeners with one practical tip. What's one practical tip you can leave people with today to help them if they're in a bad place, whether it's emotionally or in business, or they're just trying to get up and get out of the situation they're in?
Think a good thought, because it's your mind that takes you down. It's not necessarily real.
So your thoughts lie. Your
thoughts lie to you. Yeah, I mean, and it's not, let me say something. I always thought, gee, if I could only have this, it would be great. It would be happy. And God gave it to me. And I thought, okay, if I could only have this would be wonderful. And God gave it to me, and it lost its value once I had it. Then I thought, okay, if I could only have this, and he gave it to me. And after I had it, it didn't have the meaning that it had before I got it. The only one thing that never lost its value and gained its value was God. Remember, all those things that I had just started crumbling. It deteriorated. You can make more money, but you'll never make more time, except one place. There is eternity. That's my faith. That's not your faith necessarily, but just know what you don't believe in. Trust me, there's a lot more there.
I love that.
So it worked for me.
She's very passionate. I told you, cross between Lucille Ball, Tasmanian Devil. Very passionate.
And you know what?
I love
they call me a Tasmanian. So But
She's awesome.
no, but don't forget to live, because
Yeah, you didn't do a lot of that.
yeah, no, and I regret some of that.
Yeah.
I regret not spending more time. I
Mhm.
watch you and Chloe, and I think, wow, why couldn't I have taken a little more time? But I had to also
I also
make
had more
decisions.
opportunity to do that than you did.
Yeah, and if I would have just known the anatomy, I would have been able to say, "Hey, that's your thyroid." But
She's talking about my cancer, but we didn't know that. So
no, I didn't know where the thyroid was, if it was in the neck or the butt.
Okay, well, on that note,
All right.
know your anatomy. So that was fabulous. This is my mom. I told you, toughest person I've ever met. So she has overcome more than any person that I know. And if you read my book, you will understand what I mean. She's still making some of it sound a little sweeter and easier than it was, because that's her nature. It was hard, but it was good.
Well, let me ask you something. How many people in their mid-60s, after a devastating fire, would start over?
Yeah, no, it was hard. You started with nothing. Again, you started over.
Now I started with 3 things: a 4-drawer file cabinet Bible, and if God is for you, who can be against you? In 8 weeks, we were sailing.
Yep. And you rebuilt. So that's my mom. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something. Please post what you've learned, tag me, and I will answer these questions when we're done. If you are struggling and you know you're in a bad place, you can reach out to one of our doctors at 844-818-0616. Please don't suffer in silence. Don't suffer alone. And we look forward to seeing you next week on Relentless Courage. I have a special guest for you.